Climate change. The danger with climate change is that we talk about that as if it's the only ecological crisis, as if we're not destroying the oceans at incredible speed, on which of course tens if not hundreds of millions of people depend for their survival. As if we're not destroying the topsoil, as if we're not sucking the fossil water out of the ground at unimaginable speed. You know, these water sources across the world that have taken tens of millions of years in some cases to build up, and the kind of crazy industrial profit-led farming methods that we use are sucking that up at an unimaginable speed. We are kind of polluting at an unimaginable rate across the world in all sorts of ways. We've come up with our industry, through our industry, with all sorts of incredibly toxic processes that are damaging, you know, the livelihoods, especially of the most vulnerable. I think in this country we haven't really had an environmental justice movement in a way that perhaps in the US we have. And what the environmental justice movement is all about is that it's the poorest, most vulnerable people that tend to live next to what they call sacrifice zones, i.e. the places where the really heavy, polluting, dirty industry takes place, you know, the places where millions of people are suffering all sorts of illnesses, nervous disorders, birth defects, asthma, etc. But yeah, so I guess the first thing I want to say is, you know, this isn't about the environment in terms of trees and polar bears. This is that on which we depend for our very survival. And the reason this is such a difficult issue to get people to engage with at a visceral level is that our whole culture is based on kind of denying our dependence on the planet for our existence, on dominating nature, on you know, industry being you know, being able to sort of step to the side of nature almost. But if you were an alien from outer space coming down and looking at that ideology, you'd realise that it's utterly insane. You know, our food and water and shelter depend on the planet. Twice in the last 6 years, in case anyone is still under the impression that climate change is a sort of grandchildren issue, twice in the last 6 years we've had food price spikes of about 50%. That has meant, because of the kind of crazy super capitalist system that has no compassion that we have, when food prices spike 50%, that means suddenly, you know, pretty much overnight, because that's the way that the craziness of international markets work, suddenly hundreds of millions of people simply cannot afford to provide the calories they need to their children, let alone the nutrition. So this is a food, water and shelter issue. Just a sort of show of hands, how many people have come across Naomi Klien's book? Okay, so a lot of people. Naomi Klien is an amazing figure, because she has a knack of writing books roughly every 7 years that kind of talk about something that is very kind of big in terms of how the world is actually working, that generally hasn't been talked about much before. So she wrote a book called No Logo in 1999 about how corporations had moved from a model of kind of ownership, because, you know, 100 years ago workers across the world realised that they could actually hold owners to ransom, that workers were dependent on people in their factories doing their work, and so if those people turned around and said, well, we're not going to work, then the people who own the factories were screwed. Along with globalisation, what corporations have managed to do, wherever possible, and it depends slightly on the industry concerned, is have subcontracts. So they don't own any factories, they have a short-term rolling subcontract with a subcontractor in China or Bangladesh or whatever it is. And if the workers start getting uppity and asking for, you know, not to be sort of polluted or enslaved or, you know, paid terribly at work, then they just end the subcontract and move it somewhere else. And what she also details in that book is how informational power has become incredibly crucial to corporations and to the wider political system. That corporations realise that by kind of building this kind of brand and spending in many cases up to 50% of their budget on their branding, on the propaganda, on the kind of manipulating our hearts and minds into thinking that their brand represents something kind of genuine that we should want to connect to and aspire to. They've managed to sort of free themselves, A, from, you know, striking workers, but B, from having to kind of create decent products in many cases. Like, it's probably not a surprise to many people here that a lot of branded goods that, you know, you might pay 50 quid for are made for 50p in the same sweatshop that makes, you know, other goods for somebody else that go for £5, you know. So it's basically been a way of kind of generating unprecedented profits in the history of the planet. This is what we've seen in the neoliberal period, and I hesitate to use the phrase neoliberal because it's a propaganda phrase. It's got liberal in there, so if you don't know that much about it, you're like, well, liberal, that's freedom, that sounds pretty good. This is what an economist called Joseph Stiglitz called market fundamentalism. This is about a system where democracy has been replaced with the power of corporations. But what Naomi Klien's second book was about was, it's called The Shock Doctrine, The Rise of Disaster Capitalism, and that's really relevant to the climate change that I'm going to talk about. It's about how the power system has developed in such a way over the last 30, 40 years that it doesn't need stability. It actually profits increasingly from crisis, whether that's the Iraq War, so a man-made crisis where shock and awe of millions of tons of bombs being dropped on a defenseless people. That can be the shock that creates the crisis that enables them to push through all sorts of things they can never push through otherwise. So in Iraq you had this kind of market fundamentalist wet dream. The Americans came in, they ripped up the law as it existed before, they fired all the government workers, they set up a system where companies could invest in Iraq and basically take all the profits out of the country. They had no obligations to the people of Iraq. But so that was one example of where the crisis was used to push through this completely undemocratic, hellish system. They did the same with the tsunami in 2006. Millions of insanely vulnerable people, many of whom were killed. The ones that survived were shoved into kind of, corrugated tin shelters, often in sweltering heat, and instead of the huge amounts of money being given by people across the world to help the victims of the tsunami being used to kind of allow them to come back to their beachfront communities, instead that crisis was used as a pretext to keep them in their hideous refugee shelters and to privatize the beachfronts and sell it off to developers, etc. And what was brilliant about the shock doctrine was that book came out the year before the economic crisis hit, and the economic crisis was the most spectacular example of what she was talking about in that book, namely an enormous sort of shock in the form of the economic crisis, that the 1% turning around going, everything's going to collapse unless you give us hundreds of billions of pounds, and in that moment when nobody understood what was going on, people heard everything's going to collapse, that's not very good, and we just gave them absolutely bloody everything. And for people who've come to sort of understand what was going on since then, we could perfectly well have wound down the banks and allow the bondholders of the banks that make all the profits when things are going well to take that enormous hit. The banks would still have functioned, we'd still have had our bank accounts and our houses, etc. But so that bailout was the bailing out of stupidly rich people. There was a guy here called David Malone speaking yesterday that's actually done really good sort of investigative digging work into who actually got bailed out, and in many cases these bailouts were going in literally tens and hundreds of millions of pounds worth of current and future taxpayers' money to bail out the banks, going to particular insanely wealthy billionaires and individuals. So that was the shock doctrine in the most spectacular way. The link with climate change is that climate change is yet another crisis that is being used to push through all sorts of kind of new profit making, all sorts of new land grabbing that they would never be able to get away with otherwise. So literally in the name of dealing with climate change, you've got people being shoved off their land, in their millions across the developing world, in order to protect forests because they can then provide carbon credits. So literally saying, it's literally like the most polluting people in industries in the world turning around going, we can carry on burning coal in the US and the UK because it's alright, this bit of forest that might have been chopped down otherwise, we've paid some money so it's not going to be chopped down, and we've kicked out the people that used to live there, etc., that depended on it for their existence, also they can carry on as before and make more money. In many cases, like the last year there was a thing called the Global Alliance for Food Security that was essentially the G8 trying to undermine a reasonable kind of UN kind of food movement to try and give something like food sovereignty to people, and food sovereignty just being the idea that people should have some control over their food system because they actually need it for their basic survival. What the corporations of the world of course want is the opposite of food sovereignty. They want this kind of insane global protection racket where literally every mouthful of food, every ear of corn that is grown involves giving a major major cut to literally a handful of agribusiness corporations, Monsanto, Syngenta. They are literally trying to sew up the global food system so that nothing else can grow. And obviously the more they trash the land and the more degraded the soils become, the more that they become dependent on these kind of crazy Frankenstein technologies that lots of evidence suggests are linked to incredible health defects, not to mention that these things are totally irreversible in terms of their impacts. Once you've got genetic modification, genetically modified seeds, crossbreeding with other seeds, there's pretty much no way of reversing that. So to link with the climate crisis, according to the World Bank and the International Energy Agency, and I quote these people because they are incredibly mainstream, right-leaning, centrist institutions, that there are plenty of environmentalists, plenty of scientists in their thousands who've been saying the same thing for decades, but the World Bank and the International Energy Agency said that what we are set to build in the next 5 years alone in terms of the infrastructure of the fossil fuel economy will be enough definitely to take us over the 2 degrees into the sort of what some people have called the catastrophic death spiral, i.e. to the point where the climate change is accelerating out of our control so fast that nothing we then do can prevent the collapse of the ice sheets, the melting of the Siberian tundra, underneath which lies literally billions and billions of tons. I think I'm actually correct in saying over 1 trillion tons of methane. An area twice the size of Germany, as the ice that's holding that methane in melts, and it's already melting and bubbling as we speak, that methane will be enough to catapult us way beyond even the 4 degrees rise that the scientific consensus across the world would constitute the collapse of civilization. We're already seeing hundreds of millions of people displaced by climate change. There was a book that came out in 2010, so 5 years ago already, about the numerous military conflicts across the world that already have a major climate component. So the chaos in Syria came directly after 3 years of drought in Syria, which drove millions of people off their land, out of subsistence lifestyles, into the cities. And obviously, I think we all agree that kind of genuine democratic revolution